One of the hardest things to do in life sometimes is slow down. I don't know where you're at in your life stage. It kind of changed. You're young and you're always running. You have lots of energy, and then you got those young family years where life gets busier and busier and busier and busier, and you feel like you're always chasing the ball. So it's like watching 6-year-old soccer. What is 6-year-old soccer? Everybody runs to the ball. And then the ball goes over there, I'll run to the ball, and just running back and forth all over the field. And it's kind of fun to watch a little bit. For 6-year-olds, by the time they get to be 7, they better be growing out of that, right? But that's kind of life. We just feel like we're running from place to place, and it's hard to slow down. It's hard to take a break and step away from it. In fact, today we live in a world of amazing technology. I was reading an article this week about how technology has so drastically changed our lives, and these articles show up from time to time, and I find them interesting because most of us in here, to one degree or another, grew up in a day when if you want to talk on the phone, you actually had to be relatively close to the wall, right? Now you don't have to be home. You can be wherever you are and talk on the phone. Technology has changed, computers and phone, all these things. It's so different. I saw something recently, maybe you've heard this before, that in your phone you have more technology than it took to put the first man on the moon. There's an awful lot of stuff. And also it's supposed to make your life easier, right? And yet it doesn't. It seems to complicate it, because it used to be you could forget things, and now they pop up as reminders on your phone, and you're not allowed to forget them anymore. You have to put snooze, right? I want to snooze that one for about a year and a half, and I'll come back, because life's just too busy. And so to find rest and to find some leisure in our busy world seems difficult, because there's a lot to do, and it makes it hard to rest. But even when we find time to rest, even when we find time to take a break, sometimes it's even hard to take a break. Why? Because there are so many different ways to take a break. There's so many different things to do. Again, when you look around the world at the hobbies, the media, the activities, the things we can do, and then you mix in that the sunsets where you can just sit and watch, and the sun rises. Some people don't know the sun rises in the morning because you've never seen it, right? But you can just sit and take it in, and you got your vacations and your staycations and all these things going on. You got so many different options. What are we going to do? And how many of you have ever gone on vacation? Okay, I got to get home so I can take a break. Now, I'm the kind of person when I go on vacation, we're someplace, and like we got to do everything in the world. We got to see all these museums and go to this park and that park and see this and that and the other thing. And sometimes you just want to sit. The last vacation we took was probably the first time in a long time I've just sat. It was kind of nice for a little bit, and then it gets kind of boring, like I got to go home and do some stuff. But sometimes it's hard because there's so many things to do. Even when you go home at night, you got so many things to do. You got your hobbies, you got your cleaning, you got your work, but then you got the TV, the big 55-inch with 450,000 channels, and the remote control. You got the remote. You don't want to know what's on. You want to know what else is on. And so you sit there, for hours. I got 450 channels, and there's nothing to watch. It's our downtime. That time, it's not taken up by work. It's not taken up by school. There's no obligation put on us. We are free to do whatever we want during that time. It's kind of the equivalent of what, if you're into government spending and stuff, there's this category of the government budget that's called discretionary spending. I don't know exactly what that means, except the word discretionary is supposed to mean you can spend on different things or whatever. This is our discretionary time. It's not mandated for something. It's not taken up by your employer. It's time that you're free to do whatever you want, and there's all kinds of options. And for many people, that's a world that Jesus never gets into. That's a world that Jesus has never managed to make it to yet. You work hard, say, God created me to work, I'm supposed to work hard. You got your family, and I'm supposed to love my family and take care of my family because God gave them to me, and I got to take care of them, and you got all these obligations, but then you have your me time. This is me time. This is what I do. I'm going to pursue what I want to pursue. I'm going to pursue pleasure. I'm going to pursue self-satisfaction, and I'm going to do what I want to do, and then you start looking at all the options of, well, what is it I want to do? And that might look different for different people. What might be restful and enjoyable for me might be a nightmare for you. And what you think to be fun and exciting would be horrible. I have friends, I see them, they tweet out, 15-mile run. I feel totally refreshed. I'm like, you're just an idiot. If I go 15 miles, it's going to be in a car. I can't stand. I don't know how in the world that could be refreshing anybody, but there are people who claim that, so they're either liars or strange. I'm not sure which yet. Did you know that rest is a biblical doctrine? Last week we talked about the doctrine of vocation, the work that God's called us to do. But rest is also a biblical doctrine. In fact, if you don't rest, you're disobedient. So I'm like, yes, I'm going home today. I'm taking a nap all afternoon because Jesus told me to. It is, right? I mean, remember when we talked about this last week, the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you work and do all your labor, and on the seventh day you rest. Why? Well, because in 6 days the Lord created the heavens and earth and everything that's in them, and on the seventh day he rested. Now God didn't rest because he was tired. God didn't rest because it took him 6 days and needs the day off. God could have done it that quickly. God could have spoke one word and everything came into existence. That's not the way he did it. Why is it that God created the world in 6 days and then rested on the seventh? So that humans would have a pattern for how to live life in God's world. And so at the very beginning of understanding how does God meet us in our downtime, how does God meet us in that leisure time of life is we got to start with the idea that rest and relaxation and pleasure is part of God's creation and part of God's plan for your life. Some people have this idea. I've described God to people this way before. They have this idea of God like the carnival game. How many of you ever been at the carnival game and you got, the box in front of you, got these 6 holes and the thing pops up and you got a hammer, right? And what's your job? You hit it back down. And then this one pops up and you're just, you're trying to hit all these down. Eventually they pop up faster than you can. Some people have that idea of God. The God's like that carnival game. And you're the little gopher popping up out of the hole and God's just sitting there with a hammer. And yet, unlike the carnival game that eventually gets too fast for you to win, never gets too fast for God. He's just waiting for you to pop your head up so he can pound it back down in the ground because God doesn't want you to have any fun at all. Do you know that's a lie from Satan? Satan is the one who said God doesn't want you to have any fun. In fact, that's what Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 4 calls the doctrine of demons. That you should abstain from certain things. And Paul says, listen, God created these things for us to be enjoyed. God created things for us to be received with thanksgiving. When somebody tells you to abstain from this pleasure or that pleasure that God has created for you, they are lying to you. They're telling you the doctrine of demons. That fourth commandment is an interesting one because it's the only commandment that's not repeated in the New Testament. Out of all the other 10 commandments, the other 9 are all repeated in one form or another. But that Sabbath day commandment was not repeated. It was a uniquely Israelite thing. It was a sign of the covenant. And God had called his people every week, I want you to set aside a day as a sign of the covenant, as a regular reminder that you belong to me. That this day is different than all the rest. It was the day that was set aside from the normal pattern of life. So you're not to do certain things on that day. Now, it wasn't a complete cessation of work. Because people still had to eat, right? The animals still had to be fed. All these things still had to be done. Priests still worked offering sacrifices. But it was to be a day that was given to rest for reflection on God and his covenant with them. And it stemmed from God's pattern in creation. 6 days he worked, the seventh he rested. 6 days you work, the seventh you rest. This is not repeated for us in the New Testament. But here's what's interesting is that carrying on into the New Testament, did you know that the early church still had a day of worship to God? It was no longer the seventh day. It was the first day of the week. They met together on the first day of the week. Starting with the day Jesus rose from the dead, they are gathered together, meeting with him on the first day of the week. And that appears to be the continued pattern throughout the New Testament, as the church met on the first day of the week for worship and for reflection on the truth of God, for teaching. And that's not the only time they met. Remember, the book of Acts says they met daily from house to house. But the church gathered on the first day of the week. You know, I think there's value for us in recognizing the principle behind this day of rest. That the day of rest that God commanded was not commanded just for Israel because, Israel worked really hard and the rest of us don't. No, it was the principle behind all of it. That there are periods of work in which we are to work because that's what God has called us to do. That was last week's message. If you weren't here for it, go listen to it online. All right? But there are periods where to work, but then there's times that we are to rest. It is part of God's command. And so one of the things we need to do when we start talking about how God meets us in our downtime is realize downtime is acceptable to God. In fact, downtime is commanded by God. If you work 24/7, you're sinful. If you don't work 24/7, you're sinful still. But the particular act of working all the time and never resting is sinful before God. Why? Because God has commanded us to rest. And so we need to think carefully about our work patterns. Did you ever think about this? That life is meant to wear you out so you can sleep well? That's what life is meant to do. You're supposed to go work hard every day so when you lay down at night, have you ever had one of those nights you don't even really know you actually fell asleep the minute your head hit the pillow because you were so tired because you worked so hard and you're so worn out and you sleep all the way through the night and you wake up the next morning? That's what life was designed to do. And so we, like Israel, we need time to set aside to worship God. We need time to set aside to rest and to enjoy God's creation, which then raises the question, what is rest then? All right, God commanded us to rest. What is that? It's obviously not just sleep, right? I mean, physical rest of sleep is a part of God's plan for us. Now, our body simply will not work 24 hours a day, not for very many days in a row. You might have a job where a time or two you pulled an all-nighter. And eventually that's going to get really old. Probably by about the second night, you're going to be nodding off in the middle of it. Maybe you're one of those school types, and as the end of the semester draws near, you start pulling the all-nighters. I know somebody who did that once. Those days will pass, but that's not the best way to go about it, right? I mean, we are not designed to stay awake. So there's that physical sleep of rest. But I think there's also the physical rest of relaxation. That there's a certain amount of rest in changing what we do. See, rest is not inactivity. Rest can be taking a break from our normal things. Now again, remember the creation pattern. God created 6 days, and on 7th day rested. Did God stop working on the 7th day? Yes or no? God is still working. In fact, think of some of the things he's doing. John chapter 5, verse 17 says, Jesus says, my Father is working until now. And I'm working with him. God's rest was not the complete cessation of work. Okay, he was still sustaining the universe. He was still keeping everything in order. He had stopped creating. Now, here's what I think rest is from a biblical perspective. Let me see if I can say this and then kind of defend this for you from the scriptures. I think rest is defined by a break in your normal routine that refreshes and relaxes you. Rest is a break in your normal routine that refreshes and relaxes you. And again, that can be different things for different people. The things that relax and refresh me may not be the same things that relax and refresh you. In fact, they may be the things that cause you stress and make you tense and cause you to want to go jump off a bridge. Right? Different people view things different ways. But rest is a break in the normal routine that refreshes and relaxes you. God didn't create us to enjoy his world. Sometimes we forget that. I mentioned that God, with the hammer who's just waiting for you to have fun so he can put a stop to it. Bam, bam, bam. God created us. And the whole book of Ecclesiastes was a book that was written dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure. Solomon, remember Solomon, King Solomon? He said, I set out to do everything I could do to try to figure out what life's about. And whatever my eyes wanted, I got. Whatever my heart desired, I pursued it. I got everything I wanted. And sometimes we'd like to live that life. We'd like to have the kind of money Solomon had to pursue all those things. We'd see all those things out there we want. You know what Solomon found out? All this pursuit of pleasure, turns out wasn't that big a deal to begin with. Because he got it all. If there's anything to be gotten in that era, he had it. And then he said, you know what, this is all just confusing. But you know what he says at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes? Back when I was a kid, I was a little bit of a downer at times. Things haven't changed all that much, maybe. But my youth pastor said to me one time, he says, Larry, you need to learn to have fun. And he quoted this verse to me. Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 9. He said, rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of your young manhood. Follow the impulses of your heart and the desire of your eyes. You know, I don't think that's Solomon going off the rails of God's plan for life. I don't think Solomon there is writing something that God said, no, Solomon, I can't inspire that. You can't write that down. That wasn't what this was. I think Solomon was onto something. That God created his world to be enjoyed. God created his world to be refreshing and relaxing, to seek pleasure in it. So rejoice and seek that pleasure. And some of you know Ecclesiastes 11, verse 9, and you know I didn't stop at the end, don't you? There's something that follows that. What is it? Follow the impulse of your heart and the desires of your eyes, yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. So here's this command. Listen, go out and enjoy life. Go out and pursue the pleasure that God has given us to pursue. Enjoy life. But while you're enjoying it, remember there's going to be a judgment for it. So this is not a total open-ended hedonism. This isn't, hey, whatever you want to do, you just do it because there's no consequences. That's not what this is. This is go enjoy life God's way, because God one day is going to bring you into judgment for it. See, when people understood this command to enjoy life, there were some people who did go off the rails. All right, we call those libertines. Maybe you've heard that word. It's kind of liberty with an N-E-S on the end, libertines. People who made it their practice to do whatever they wanted. They thought, even as Christians, even those professing to follow Christ, they thought that God had given them forgiveness and now they had permission to do anything they wanted, however they wanted. There were no consequences and no limits and no boundaries whatsoever. They were libertines. They could do whatever they wanted. The Bible sometimes uses a word, the old King James Version uses the word lasciviousness. What was lasciviousness? Lasciviousness was just open debauchery, whatever they wanted. There were people who thought they could do that. There were people who thought it was totally acceptable to do anything at all with no restraint. Now, there were people on the other end of that. They were called ascetics. It's a big word for people who said, don't have any fun in life. So on the one end, you had people who said, have fun however you want. You just pursue pleasure however you want to pursue it. Do anything. There are no restraints at all because God rules the world and God created all this stuff. So you can do it. And by the way, Jesus died for all this stuff too. And so if he died for it, might as well take advantage of it, right? No need to leave some money on the table, so to speak. And so those were libertines. On the other end, there were people who said, no. It's not that you can do everything. You actually can't do anything. That's pleasurable. You need to try to make your life as miserable as possible. In other words, be a parent to yourself. All right? Make your life as miserable as possible. Because if you deny yourself all this pleasure, you will be more pleasing to God. There are some people, I've actually heard people say this, that if my flesh likes it, I suspect it's wrong. Oh, man, that must be a hard way to live. It's dangerous. There were people who taught that. There were people who in the New Testament had this kind of decree. Don't handle it, don't taste it, don't touch it. Abstain from all these things. Now some of you say, where'd you get that from? And some of you know where I got that from, right? That's Colossians chapter 2. There were some who would tell these new Christians, hey, no, don't touch that. Doesn't matter what that is, don't touch it. Don't taste that stuff. Don't handle that. Stay away from all. If there's any possibility it might bring you pleasure, stay away from. You know what Paul said to that in Colossians chapter 2? He said, if you've died with Christ to the elementary principles of this world, why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit to yourself to decrees like don't handle it, don't taste it, don't touch it? These things refer to things which are destined to perish with use. They're going to go away one day. These are the commandments and teachings of men. These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom and self-made religion and self-abasement, severe treatment of the body. That was an ascetic. Self-made wisdom, severe treatment of the body. Don't do it. But they are of no value against fleshly indulgence. Do you catch that? See, Paul says there's all these people out there making this list of rules for you. Don't taste it, don't taste it, don't taste it, don't touch it, don't handle it, stay away from it. If you do this, you'll be more godly. You'll be more righteous, you'll be more holy. And Paul said, no, those are of no value against fleshly indulgence because it completely misunderstands what the problem is. You see, God created his world to be enjoyed. God created his world to be lived in with pleasure. How many of you are familiar with the story of Midas? The king, everything he touched turned to gold. Wouldn't that be a great life? Turned out it wasn't, right? Because everything he touched turned to gold. Sin has a Midas touch. Because almost everything in this world has been affected by sin. God created it to be enjoyed, and yet sin came in and broke it. And then sin begins to kind of leak into everything. And sin has the capacity to corrupt almost everything in this world, kind of like the Midas touch. And so when we come to this idea of rest and relaxation and pleasure, it's something God commanded for us, but like everything else, the tentacles of sin have begun to stretch their way into rest and relaxation and pleasure, such that even our rest can be corrupted by sin. Even our relaxation can be corrupted by sin. How is it that this happens? Well, one way this happens is laziness. One of the pitfalls of rest is, hey, God created me to rest, so I'm going to rest. And that turns into laziness. What is laziness? Laziness is not doing nothing. That's typically what we think, right? You're doing nothing. You're just lazy. Laziness is not doing nothing. What is laziness? Laziness is not doing what you should do when you should do it. Laziness has two components, a what and a when. All right? Laziness is when you don't do what you should do when you should do it. Procrastination is quite often laziness. Right? Doing the wrong thing can be laziness. Why? Because you put off what you should have done. Now, there comes a time when you should lay on the couch and take a nap. That's not laziness. There comes a time when you should get up and go to work. If you lay on the couch when you should get up and go to work, that's laziness. When the Proverbs talks about the sluggard, you love this picture of the Proverbs. You know, go to the ant, you sluggard. Look at the ant. Look at all the stuff she does. What was the problem with the sluggard? The problem with the sluggard is that he didn't do what he should have done when he should have done it. The ant goes and puts away food for the season. The sluggard doesn't. Go and look at the vineyard of the lazy man. What's it look like? It looks like a mess. It's all grown up, all the weeds, all the thorns, all the thistles. The garden wasn't the problem. The problem was he let it get out of hand. He didn't do the work. One of the pitfalls of rest, relaxation, and pleasure is laziness. We don't know when to stop resting. One of the reasons, laziness comes about, there's an abundance, there's a lack of necessity. Most of us don't grow our own food, right? You might have a hobby garden in the back, but most of you probably spend quite a bit of time and money at the grocery store. You couldn't have done that 200-300 years ago. If you didn't plant your crops, guess what you did? You went hungry. You starved. You see, there's a sense in which modern conveniences have contributed to laziness. There's also a sense in which modern conveniences have also created to overwork, by the way. That we can never seem to get away from it because it's always there with us. But one of the pitfalls of rest is we've forgotten when to get up and go to work again. One of the pitfalls of rest is mindlessness. One of the things that happens, there's this word amusement. Probably historically, way back, if you trace where that word came from, the word muse meant to think. Amusement meant to not think. So there's idea behind of amusement, man, just mindlessness. Now, all amusement is not mindless. Amusement these days can just be enjoyable, but there's a sense in which when we get into rest and relaxation, we get kind of mindless. Remember the old proverb, not the proverb from the Bible, but one that really fits well with the principles of the Bible, is an idle mind is the devil's workshop. And that idleness of mind can lead to an openness, to a laziness of mind that creates in us a problem for our rest. Because our rest ultimately becomes a place that then begins to draw us away from God in our thinking. Sometimes the pitfalls of rest can lead to indoctrination. I want to start down this road for just a moment and talk about why this works. In our lives, when we start talking about rest and relaxation, we are faced with the possibility of many different things to do. I mentioned that earlier, right? You got TV with all those channels on it. You've got the internet with all those billions and billions of web pages that you can spend hours and hours and hours. Some of you did, and then 3 hours later, like, oh, wow, I've just been surfing web pages for 3 hours. I have no idea where the time went to. And what happens in that is that so much of the media that competes for our attention today is designed to indoctrinate us, to desensitize us to evil, and then ultimately to entice us to participate in evil. Now, some of you, when you hear this, you're starting to get a little nervous because you've been in church services, maybe in the old school days when the pastor would get up and give lists of things, right? And you remember some of those things that Christians weren't supposed to do. And pastors would give plainly stated, do this, do that, don't do this. And so there was a list of things you could listen to, a list of things you could watch. There was a list of places you could go to and a list of activities you could participate in. Some of you can remember back in the days, and maybe some of you are still of this opinion. If you are, it's fine with me. But some of you remember back in the days when playing cards were bad, right? That was on the no-no list. Don't use playing cards. Right? It became a big problem around the mid-'80s or so. Because what happened in the mid-'80s? Every computer you bought had what on it? Solitaire. Playing cards right on the screen. What in the world do we do now? Some of you can remember when Christians weren't supposed to go to movie theaters. And then the 1980s happened again. And those 3 big letters, VCR and Blockbuster. You know, we have a whole generation of kids today who are going to grow up never knowing what Blockbuster was. But all of a sudden, life's changing because I don't go to movies. I don't need to go to movies now. I just go rent them, a couple of weeks after it comes out. I just go rent a Blockbuster and bring it home, right? And all of a sudden, we had this whole kind of things going on. And there are many people today who are dying for a list. Some of you sitting out there, hey, pastor, give us your list. You don't want my list. My list has about 3 categories on it. There are good things, there are bad things, and there are stupid things. Right? Do the good things. Don't do the bad things. A lot of stuff's just stupid. It's not bad, it's just dumb. Like, why would you do that? But you don't need to live by my list. Many people want a list so they can know what to do. Pastor, tell me, how can I spend my leisure time? What can I do? What can I not do? Some people, you just want a list because you want to argue. No, I don't think that should be on the list. All right, fine. Whatever. I got no list for you this morning. But there's many people scared of a list. Oh, no, pastor's going to be telling us all these things we shouldn't do. And the reason you're scared is because there's some things on your regular habits of relaxation and leisure, and you're not 100% clear in your conscience that it's acceptable to God. And you're scared to death that the preacher is going to say something that's going to cross your list, and you're not sure it should be there anyway. By the way, the Bible tells us what to do with those things. I don't know if you know. It's in Romans chapter 14. If it's not of faith, if you can't do it in faith, you're pleasing God, it's sin. Okay? Now, I'm not going to give you a list this morning. You know why? You don't want my list. And I don't want to argue with you about a list. A list doesn't teach you how to think. A list doesn't teach you how to evaluate anything. A list doesn't teach you how to judge between your conscience and the Scripture and the possibilities. The lists are easy, but they don't last very long. It's going to be out of date in a few years. Why? Because the world's going to change. Things are going to change. But some of you will still be hanging on to it because, hey, preacher said that 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 30 years ago, and bless God, he can't be wrong. Thanks for your confidence, but no. See, one of the problems with lists is lists don't teach us how to develop biblical discernment. Lists don't teach us how to evaluate the world we live in light of God's command to rest and God's command to seek pleasure and the possibility that sin has corrupted pleasure. Lists can never teach you how to be godly. So what do we do? What I want to encourage you to do is you think about how Jesus meets you in your relaxation, your downtime. What I want you to do is develop biblical discernment. I want you to develop a biblical discernment. I don't want you to... Now listen, I'm willing to have conversations. Hey, Pastor, what do you think about this? Hey, Larry, what do you think about that? I might be willing to have that conversation with you. There's a pretty good chance my answer might be to you, I don't know, what do you think? So be prepared to interact, because I'm not going to be giving, decrees about what you can and can't do. What I want to challenge us to do is say, hey, this is what God has said about His world. This is what God has said about pleasure. Now, what does that look like for me? So what do I have to do? Well, the foundation of all this, you have to be committed to rest an appropriate amount of time. You've got to be committed to rest an appropriate amount of time. There's times when it's okay to sit down and take it easy, to step back and relax. The world is not going to spin off its axis without you. I love the story of Jesus being on the Sea of Galilee in the storm. And the disciples are rowing and trying to... You know what Jesus is doing? He's sleeping, right? And the disciples are working so hard, and Jesus is sleeping. They go back and say, Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing? And what's Jesus' response? Oh, I didn't mean to sleep that hard. I was so tired from last night, I overslept. My bad, guys. What was his response? Oh, ye of little faith. Did you think that because I rested for a few minutes, the world was going to spin off its axis? Did you think that sleep was like the difference between the world surviving and not surviving? Many of us have a God complex. And by God complex, I mean, I think sometimes we think we run it all. I remember an occasion in ministry where I'd been dealing with this thing for quite a long time, months and months and months, and engaged in some personal counseling and dealing with a problem. And I thought there was an upside. I'm like, oh, we're finally breaking through. And I was due to leave the country. And like the night before I was headed to the airport, this thing blew up again. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, man, just when I'm leaving the country, what's going to happen now? As if me being in the country was the solution to this. You know what? Sometimes we got this God complex. If I stop, if I rest, everything's going to fall apart. No, it's not. You know what happens while you're sleeping? God's still God. He hadn't changed. You know what happens while you're relaxing? God's still God. He hasn't changed. The world's not going to fall apart. We have to be committed to resting appropriately. Now, don't overwork, but don't be lazy. Again, you got to understand what God has called us to do and to be. So how is it that we develop biblical discernment? I told you I wasn't going to give you a list, so I'm going to give you a list. But it's a different kind of list, all right? Number one thing on the list is remember what your purpose is. What are you here for? Why are you in this world? For God's glory. God created the world for His glory. Worthy are you, our Lord and our God, because you created all things, and because of your will, they exist and were created. Worthy are you. God created us for His glory. That's why you're here. And if you remember that, it might change the way you start looking at rest and relaxation and pleasure. What am I here for? I'm here for God's glory. Whatever I participate in, this is for the glory of God. What does that mean? The glory of God is one of those church words. Man, it sounds really good, but I have no idea what it means. The glory of God, I think, is a word that refers to God's weightiness or God's significance. In fact, the Hebrew word for glory is a word that very often is translated heavy. Heavy. Remember the story of Eli, the high priest in the Old Testament? He was a fat dude. He was heavy. And he falls off that bench backwards. When he gets towards his sons have died, I'm referring to the story in 1 Samuel. He falls off that bench backwards and kills himself. I mean, not intentionally, but by falling off, he died. And his daughter-in-law gives birth to a son, the son of one of Eli's sons that were killed. And you know what she names him? Not heavy. Ichabod. So Ichabod, wasn't that like, no, different story. See, the word means heavy. And there's a little play on words in that story probably with Eli. Eli was heavy, but he wasn't glorious. And when Israel lost the ark, there was no more glory, there was no more heaviness. See, the glory of God is his significance, his weightiness. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to live life in light of God's significance. You're supposed to live life like God matters because he's significant. He matters. He's heavy. Remember your purpose. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God. Do it all for the significance, the heaviness of God. That's why you're here. Like, man, that sounds like I can't have any fun. Go back to the beginning. God created us to enjoy his creation. And one of the things that brings God's glory is when we use his creation to enjoy it because he gave it to us that way. Remember your purpose. Number 2, remember the gospel. Remember Jesus died to purchase you. Revelation 5, I've quoted many times. Hopefully you're starting to memorize this. They sang a new song, "Worthy are you to take the book and to break its seals. For you were slain and you purchased for God with your blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. You made them be a kingdom of priests to our God." You died and you purchased with your blood. You understand, as a child of God, if you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, you have been bought with a price. That's a quote from Scripture too, isn't it? And you know what comes next. You are not your own. You're not your own. Remember, the gospel is that your life doesn't actually belong to you. It's a gift of God to you. And when Jesus died on the cross, he purchased you. Remember the gospel. Remember God's goal for you. To conform you to the image of his Son. Romans chapter 8, verse 29, those whom he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, to change us to be like Christ. To change us to be like Christ. Philippians chapter 3, verse 21, he's going to transform the body of our humble state into conformity with the body of his glory. He's going to change us to be like him. 1 John 3, we don't know what he's like, but we'll know that when we see him, we will be like him because we'll see him as he is. Understand that God's goal for you is to conform you to the image of Jesus Christ. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind to change us. Remember the gospel. Remember the goal is Christ's likeness. And then lastly, guard your heart. Guard your heart. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23 says, "Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life." Guard your heart. You know what one of the biggest dangers in relaxation is? One of the biggest dangers of rest? It's not the physical rest. It's the mental, spiritual break that we take, where we can cease to guard our hearts. We can cease to guard our minds. And what begins to happen is things begin to get indoctrinated in us. We just adopt it. Many of you, you've noticed this process of desensitization. It's springtime, I hope. You're going to start doing a little yard work. In those early days, your hands hurt, right? By the middle of summer, your hands are used to it. Why? They became desensitized to it. One of the most dangerous things about the possibilities for rest and relaxation and amusement in our world is that we can become desensitized to the sins that Jesus died for. And we can begin to take pleasure in and begin to enjoy the things that hung our Savior on a cross. Why? Because we didn't guard our hearts. Oh, you're getting legalistic. I don't know. Guard your heart, because from it flow the springs of life. Out of your heart comes everything. When Jesus is talking to his Pharisees, remember how the Pharisees, oh, your disciples, they don't wash their hands, they're eating all this stuff, and they're defiling themselves. And what does Jesus say? No, it's not the things that go into a man that defile. It's not the food you eat that defiles you. From within, out of the heart of men proceed the evil thoughts, the fornications, the thefts, the murders, adultery, deeds of coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. These things proceed from within. That's why you need to guard your heart. Listen, our hearts are deceitfully wicked, Jeremiah says. Who can know it? That's kind of a rhetorical question. It's like, who can know it? No, we don't even understand the depths of our own sinfulness. But one of the dangers is that things begin to filter into our minds and things begin to get inside us. And first glance, oh, and the second time we're like, oh, and third time we're like, oh. And then before you know it, we've adopted it. You know why? Because we didn't guard our hearts. We didn't guard our rest and relaxation and pleasure. We pursued things, and those things changed us. You know, not everything that is good in the world is distinctively Christian. There's a lot of pleasures out there that are not distinctively Christian. They're all from God because God created them to be enjoyed. But even unbelievers can enjoy the good gifts of God. And not everything in our lives must be distinctively Christian. Again, there's some people who kind of adopt this attitude, well, if I'm going to serve God, I got to be at the church all the time. No, we don't want you here all the time. We want a little privacy every now and then, right? I'm kidding. But there's some people who have this idea, it's got to be explicitly Christian. Listen, God has created the world for us to enjoy, for unbelievers and believers alike. Enjoy God's good creation. Rest in it, but guard your heart, because there can be so many influences that turn us away from God. 1 Peter chapter 4 says this, the time past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles. And Gentiles there is a reference to unbelievers. Some people look back and sometimes we tend to get drawn back into the life of sin in the world. And Peter says, listen, you've had plenty of time to do that. The time past is sufficient for all that. But here's what he says, verse 4, 1 Peter 4. The Gentiles are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excesses of dissipation. What that means is the Gentiles are surprised you're not like they are. But you know what the problem is? Is that for so many Christians, I fear that Gentiles will be surprised to find out we are a Christian. Because sometimes we're just like them. Because the gospel of Jesus Christ has never pulled us away from the temptations of the world. The sins that Jesus died for are the sins that so easily can entertain us and then persuade us and change our values. Sometimes we acknowledge the ugliness of an act, but we refuse to abandon it in its ugliness. Why? Because it has such a hold on us. We enjoy it. We want it. Here's my word to you this morning. Jesus has commanded you to rest. Jesus has commanded you to enjoy life. Jesus has commanded you to seek pleasure in the things he has created. That's why he created them, so we could enjoy them. But Jesus commands us to remember our purpose. We're here for the glory of God. Remember the gospel. You were bought with a price. Remember the goal. Be conformed to God's image in Jesus Christ. And guard your heart. Sometimes people find themselves doing things they never thought they would do. And you know why? Because somewhere in their downtime they slipped a little bit and didn't correct it. They began to live on a pathway away from God, and they never repented and returned. They were never willing to cut things out of their life that were drawing them away from God. Well, I didn't have a list. I didn't know what to do. That's why you develop biblical discernment. That's why you know the gospel. That's why you know the sins that Jesus died for. You know what it means to live a holy life before him. as Peter said, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." That was God's command to his people in Israel. That's God's command to us. Where does it all end? One day there's a rest coming. It's called the rest of eternity. When Jesus, in Hebrews chapter 11, when Jesus' return is referred to as a rest. And there are some who will not enter into that rest. But that was what we are looking for. That should be what we're looking for. Work for the night is coming. And in that night, no more work's going to be done. But until we get to that time, enjoy God's good creation in the way that God has given it to us. And remember, Jesus doesn't stop being your Savior and your King when you're off duty. He matters then too. So pursue Him in all of His commands. Pursue Him in all of life. Let's enjoy life to the glory of God. As we close this morning, we sing, "O great God of highest heaven, occupy my lowly heart." This is our musicians are going to come, and this is what we need in the midst of our downtime. God still occupies our heart. Jesus, come, take control, teach me to follow you, even in our leisure. Let's pray together. Father, you've called us to rest. You've given us a beautiful world to rest in. You've given us so many good things to enjoy. May we enjoy them for your glory, guarding our hearts against those things which would draw us away from you. Cause us to seek your face, to remember your glory, to remember the goal for us of Christ's likeness, to remember the gospel that we were bought with a price. May we follow you and love you and live in your world a life of purity and holiness. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.